May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was in my 20s, I was a completely different person than I am just now. I'm glad of that because back then I was vain, I was selfish, and I was very driven by money. I had a life plan. I was going to get rich and I was going to do it very quickly. It started off well and I walked into many good business opportunities, some of which were successful and others not so much. There were a few times in my life when if the chips had landed one way, things could have been a runaway success. And if they landed the other way, the opportunity would never have materialised. The hard work is obviously a key ingredient to the success in any business. But equally, many extremely successful people, if they are honest, will tell you that there is at least one key opportunity, sometimes more, that come along in their life when they are in just the right place at the right time. Serendipity, if you like. Now, I won't bore you with the details, but many years ago, I found myself standing in that right place at just the right time. I had my own business in a small building and I agreed a deal with the owners of a bigger business to take over their existing premises and all the equipment that was in the premises once they had moved into a new building. Everything was agreed and we shook hands on it, and it was going to be an amazing opportunity for me. If everything had went to plan, it would have been a life-changing thing for me. However, just before these people were about to buy the new premises, another business put in an offer and bought the other building from right under the nose of the first people. Now, the only reason they were moving at all was because they had found a prime site on a busy main road, which was very, very hard to get. And so without that, they decided to stay where they were, and they stayed there until they retired, which, it was just recently. Now, my fortunes could have went either way. I was really disappointed with the way things had turned out. But do you know what? In hindsight, I think it was actually a good thing. If I had been so busy at work that was all I had time to think about, running something bigger and bigger, I might never have grown in my faith. I might never have found myself called to ministry. And even if I had, perhaps I would have resisted the call, because who knows whether I would have been able to give up whatever I had built. I may still have been that self-absorbed, selfish, financially motivated young man. The only difference is I wouldn't be a young man anymore. But of course, I've no way of knowing how things would have turned out. Looking back though, I believe things happened the way they did for a reason. And it was only after I came out of that work and I moved to Ballantrae that my pace of life slowed right down and I had the opportunity to explore my faith. I definitely think that God intervened for a reason. I had one plan, God had another plan. But now I can be joyous about what seemed to be a cruel twist of fate in my life. But God's plan was undoubtedly the better plan. Why am I telling you all this, you may ask? Well, I'm sure this may resonate with many of you today. Perhaps not in business. Perhaps some of you in other aspects of your life. And I hope that you find what I'm going to talk about equally relevant. The Apostle Paul certainly found himself in a similar position to this in his life. Once he seemed destined to be a leading Jewish priest and teacher of the law in the Sanhedrin, maybe even the chief priest. Then, after he had an encounter with Christ on the Damascus road, his life plan changed completely. He became a passionate follower of Christ. He was then completely focused on spreading the gospel throughout as much of the empire as he could. Paul had a burning desire to preach in Rome. They said back then that all roads lead to Rome. It was the centre of the Roman Empire. He sent letters to the Romans saying how much he longed to go there and to meet them. But instead of being free to do this throughout Rome, God yet again had other plans. Paul would still spread the gospel, but he would do so in a very different way from what he imagined. He would do so from prison. There are many major differences between me and Paul. In fact, I wouldn't know where to begin. Here's just one. Do you think I was happy when things didn't turn out the way I had planned in my life? No, not a bit. Do you think Paul was happy when things didn't turn out the way he had planned? Well, actually, yes. We hear in the passage that Paul rejoiced. Now, despite all the adversity that Paul faced at this time, his life was filled with joy. And that's something that we can learn a lot from. In order for us to experience true joy in our lives, we need to stop trying to make our own plans and instead try to follow God's plans for our lives. Now, how can we do this, though? The first thing we need to do is to live in obedience to God. Paul understood immediately from his encounter with Christ that we read about in Acts 9 that obedience for him was to proclaim the gospel. We read that Christ told Ananias that Paul was his chosen instrument to proclaim his name to the Gentiles and their kings, as well as to the people of Israel. Christ said that he would show Paul how much he had to suffer for Christ's name. But Paul was obedient to the letter here. If we think of what was said in Acts 9, Paul presumed he was to go to Rome to preach to the Roman Gentiles. Instead, he preached to the whole of the palace guard, and not just any guard. It was the Praetorian Guard, or the guard of the emperor himself, the emperor who assumed the role of king. We also know that Paul suffered, but it's no wonder that he was so joyous. What he was doing here was fulfilling the words of Ananias, the words that were spoken through Ananias in Acts 9, and he fulfilled them completely. Because Paul has ended up in jail, it enables him to show complete obedience to Christ's plan, to God's plan. Now, in those days, prisoners were chained to the Roman guard for 24 hours a day. The guards would change over every so often, and someone new come along, but there was always somebody there chained to the prisoner. It struck me as being a bit ironic that they think they're holding Paul captive, when in fact, Paul has them as a captive audience, constantly preaching the gospel to them day and night. It's not always easy for us to tell what God's plan is for us. But if we're obedient to him, if we live a righteous, prayerful, and biblically sound life, then I believe he will lead each of us in the right direction to fulfill that plan. It's only when we resist or try to make plans of our own that we go astray. It's often said, we make plans, God laughs. Secondly, Paul is joyful because he has contentment. He says in verse 21, For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Basically, he's saying if he lives for Christ, and that's great. But if he dies, it's even better because he will be with Christ. Not only that, but while Paul is in jail, others are preaching the gospel in his place. Even though some are doing so for the wrong reasons, such as power and position, Paul is joyous because the gospel has been preached even more. As long as Christ is proclaimed, Paul rejoices. Paul is awaiting trial here, and if he's found guilty, he could suffer the death penalty. If he's innocent, he will live. So this is a real life and death situation here. But Paul has found contentment. He's found contentment because he lives for Christ, and he would happily die for Christ. So how can we find the contentment that Paul has, even in the face of adversity? If we lead a life that is pleasing to Christ, if we follow his teachings, we will grow in our relationship with him. And then, as we do so, we will have that joy in our lives. I don't know if anyone uses the saying here, but when I was young, if someone was asked why they did something good, they might say, it was nice to be nice. And while it's a true saying, it's even nicer to be nice in a Christian fashion, sharing Christ's love with others. As well as this, when we live by Christ's words, we know that we will be found pleasing in God's sight, and that we shall receive eternal salvation that he promised us. When we consider the glorious reality of what this means, then any cares or concerns that are brought about by adversity in this life mean nothing. Just as Paul suffered for Christ's name, so shall we, though. As Christians, to say the least, we are not likely to win any popularity contests in certain circles, and we will certainly have our pains and sorrows to contend with. But when we see the bigger picture, through all this, we can be joyous and contented, just like Paul. Thirdly, Paul led a worthy life, standing firm in the gospel. It would have been so easy in that prison just to have kept his head down, to have kept quiet and not mentioned Christ or the gospel to anyone. But he would have been actively disobeying God, and he would have been racked with guilt afterwards. Instead, Paul stood firm in the gospel. And in doing so, he honoured God and he made a difference to so many people's lives. He was probably the first person to ever preach the gospel to many of this Praetorian Guard. Now, once again, we can do the same. Now, I'm not suggesting that, like Paul, taking advantage of his captive audience, you go into public transport, find somebody sitting at the window seat, hem them in and preach the gospel. That might not work for us. But we should never shy away from the opportunity when it becomes available. When it does, we too can stand firm and share our faith. Now remember, you don't need a pulpit to share the gospel. All we need is faith, a bit of biblical knowledge, and someone to listen. When we do all these things, we too will be leading a worthy life before God. By following Paul's examples of leading an obedient life, living a contented life, and living a worthy life, standing strong in the gospel, we too will be able to fulfill whatever God has planned for our lives. And we should be able to do so while experiencing real joy in our lives. Amen.